Many lonely and remote parts of the British Isles echo with tales of local spirits. Whether they're fairies, remnants of older mythologies, ghosts or land spirits decked out in another guise, their stories live on. And the northeast of England has one such spirit known as Silky. William Henderson lists Silky among the local sprite section of his 1879 folklore compendium, along with other types of fairies like brownies, the bar guest, and specific sprites like Peg Powler of Teesside. This section of his book is essentially the closest we get to a discussion of different types of fairy, and many of those featured are specific figures within their own legends. Ultimately, Silky is so named because she announces her presence with a sound like rustling silks, and in some cases the term refers to a ghost of a woman who died in some unfortunate way. But in the classic tales, Silky shows a lot of crossover with other types of fairy or mischievous creatures. So why don't we go and meet her in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore? Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We are rattling into May and as always I can't believe quite where this year is going, but there we go. And we are looking at different types of fairy this month because way back in March I did a poll and I asked what people wanted to see next. Was it the folklore of drinks, different types of fairy or something related to witchcraft? Obviously the folklore of drinks won, so that's why we did that in April. So I thought, well, I'll go on to the one that came second for what we're doing in May, and here we are. Now, it is quite interesting because the types of fairies that I've chosen pop up a lot in Northeast folklore. And I thought, you know what? I could focus on wider fairy lore, but obviously there are other people who know a lot more about that than me, like Morgan Daimler. So I thought what I'll do is I'll focus on the fairy stories or types of fairies that appear in stories related to the north of England because that's where I'm from. And it's a nice way to kind of share different kinds of fairy and particularly the lore surrounding them, beyond what I think people have started to conflate with fairy lore that appears in modern fiction. And that is unfortunately one of the downsides, I think, to people not always necessarily checking their sources. So people might believe something to be related to actual fairies when it's not and it actually comes from urban fantasy. So that's why I've actually gone back to the sources for this one. So my two main sources is one book from 1846 by M.A. Richardson and the other is a compendium from 1879 by William Henderson. So they're the two major sources that I've used. And again, obviously they've collected these stories from other people, but at least it means it goes back to that period when people were actually going around collecting folklore. So the first incarnation of Silky that we're going to look at is essentially what you might call the Classic Silky. Obviously not to be confused with Silky. So Silky is literally as in the type of material, so Silky. And a particularly famous Silky plagued the village of Blackheddon, which is about 2.5 miles directly north of Stamford in Northumberland. And this all happened in the closing years of the 18th century. If you're not familiar with Northumberland to that degree, Blackheddon, as the crow flies, is about 13 miles northwest of Newcastle upon Tyne itself. So it's quite nice for me, obviously, to be featuring stories that I'm familiar with because I'm from the area. But M.A. Richardson dates the disturbances in Blackheddon to 60 or 70 years ago from the point when he was writing, which basically puts them in the late 1770s, early 1780s. And he explains the name for Silky came, and I quote, from its manifesting a marked predilection to make itself visible in the semblance of a female dressed in silk, end quote. And apparently Silky had a propensity to scare anyone who found themselves having to make journeys at night. She would follow them and then just suddenly appear in all of her splendour at the most boring part of the road. Obviously that would give people a bit of a fright, but she especially preferred people on horseback because then she would clamber up behind the rider, rustling in her silks as she did so, before then disappearing without warning after the rider had carried her some distance along the road. And Richardson describes her as dissolving, so she became, and I quote, incorporated with the nocturnal shades, end quote. And this is one reason why I love books from the 1840s, because the way they express themselves is just completely different, obviously, from what we're familiar with now. Now, as fairy behaviour goes, it is really rather tame, and it seems a little bit more annoying than anything else, and Richardson even describes the locals as actually just being, and I quote, dreadfully annoyed by the pranks, end quote. But a lot of it is also quite inconvenient as well, so while on one hand it's that kind of level of ridiculous prank or practical joke that people play now, at the same time you can imagine it would be quite irritating if it actually happened to you. Now, Silky's general demeanour saw her causing havoc pretty much wherever possible, so if someone cleaned their home on a Saturday to free their Sunday up for some rest, Silky would then turn everything upside down during the night. Yet conversely, if someone left the house in a complete mess, Silky would tidy up for them. And I can't help thinking it seems fairly obvious which course of action was best to adopt in that case. And this does actually tie her in with a lot of the legends that you get around brownies, and we are going to investigate them a little bit more later on in this month. Now, many of the tales actually focus on Silky's control over horses specifically, and she certainly knew how to pick her moments, because her favourite trick involved waiting until the horses were hard at work at a given task, whatever that might be, and then she would cause them to freeze, and no amount of soothing or cajoling could get them to move again. Now, Silky might decide on a whim to remove the enchantment and let the poor animal continue its work. Otherwise, anyone enchanted basically had to wait until dawn to break her spell, because it seems like she could only really operate between sunset and sunrise. Alternatively, workers knew to use witchwood, which is otherwise known as rowan, since the wood of this magical tree would just slice through her bewitchment, and obviously there is the episode about rowan specifically if you're interested in more tales about rowan folklore. Now, in one particular tale, a farmer had sent a servant to the colliery to fetch coals, and then held upon his errand, he then faced returning in the evening, which obviously he wasn't particularly happy about because he knew these stories about Silky. And as it happened, Silky lay in wait at a bridge between Stamfordham and the colliery, which was sometimes known as Silky's Brig. And you have to wonder how many times did she actually waylaid people here if the bridge then even had her name. Now, once the servant reached the middle of the bridge, the horses came to a complete standstill and they just absolutely refused to move. Now, the servant didn't enjoy the prospect of being kept there until sunrise, but thankfully a servant from a neighbouring farm came upon the unhappy scene. He had rowan wood with him and thus broke the spell. Now, the servant simply carried along on his way with the coal, reaching the farm safely. Obviously, I'm assuming the horses were safe as well. But the servant always carried rowan with him on future journeys to ensure that he was never caught out again. Now, Silky also had a favoured spot at Belsay, which is just over 2 miles to the northeast of Blackheddon. And Belsay, if you are in the northeast, is a fabulous place to visit because obviously you can see the Palladian mansion of Belsay Hall, the beautiful gardens, and then also Belsay Castle as well, which is sort of through the Quarry Gardens. It is pretty much my favourite place to visit in the northeast, so if you do get the chance, it is an English heritage property, do see if you can pop along. Now, Silky enjoyed wandering around the wooded crag in this area at night, and apparently this was on those evenings when she wasn't pestering the locals at Blackheddon. Now, anyone who happened upon her in the twilight would see her miming the act of splitting stones or cutting down trees, which seems like a really weird thing to watch someone doing, but there we go, that's what Richardson says. And strangely, the witness would hear, and I quote, the howling of a resistless tempest rushing through the woodland, end quote, but then the scene would look perfectly still and serene, so obviously the visuals and the audio essentially weren't matching. And there was a particular tree that overlooked a waterfall beside the lake at the bottom of the crag, and it had rather quite crooked and twisted limbs which formed a rough chair, which was apparently Silky's favourite place to sit and watch the world go by. And the owner of nearby Belsay Castle, Sir Charles M.L. Monk, actually had the tree preserved, and it was sometimes known as Silky's seat or Silky's chair. Now, Richardson notes that the chair was, and I quote, no longer tenanted by its aerial visitant, end quote, by 1846, but it did still have the name. So I actually got in touch with English Heritage about the myth, who were incredibly kind and helpful, and they suggest that the crag refers to the crag wood south of Belsay Hall, and that the waterfall in the story actually refers to the outfall from the South Lake nearby. And Dr. Andrew Hahn noted that the Silky story may only date to the 1840s, so it would be fascinating to know where Richardson got his information from in the first place. Still, Silky seemed to catch people's attention, and one story even saw people blaming Silky for a break-in at Belsay Hall in the 1920s. Now, no one really knows what actually happened to Silky, and when Richardson wrote about her in 1846, he noted that she just abruptly disappeared, and some of the locals wondered if she'd actually been a ghost, not a fairy. And in this theory, she'd hidden some treasure and then died, and couldn't lie still until someone found it, because she hadn't disclosed its whereabouts before she died. Now, this possibly comes from an incident at a house in Blackheddon around the time that Silky disappeared. And as the story went, a female servant was carrying out her usual duties when the ceiling suddenly gave way in the room that she was in. Something black fell through the hole and the servant fled, screaming in terror, as you would. Now, while the servant thought it was the devil falling through the ceiling, her mistress wasn't so sure. So she ventured into the room and discovered a black calf skin full of gold among the wreckage of the ceiling. And this led people to assume that Silky's spirit was laid to rest with the discovery of her treasure. Now, the truth may not be so clear-cut, and it is obviously quite difficult to specify truth on something that happened so long ago when you're essentially working with hearsay, but you know what I mean by using that word. But Henderson, in 1879, noted that Silky apparently visited an old woman from Welton Mill, and the woman related a particular incident to her vicar on her deathbed, saying that Silky had sat at the bottom of her bed the night before, and she knew it was Silky because the figure wore silk, and obviously that is indeed where Silky gets her name from. Now, because that occurred after Silky's apparent disappearance, it does raise the question of did she just simply move, or was there just more than one of them? Now, there is another famous Silky story that I do think is worth looking at because it sort of gives you a little bit more of an insight into what Silky is or was even. And the location is Denton Hall, also known as East Denton Hall, and it actually stands in Newcastle upon Tyne, and it's just off the West Road, which, as you might imagine, is the road that goes west out of Newcastle. And I know I've mentioned this before with the stunning lack of originality for northeast place names, but yes, it's next to the West Road. And the building itself was actually built in 1622 by Anthony Errington and is actually one of the region's very few examples of Jacobean architecture. And Errington, it seems, held quite a lot of sway in the area's coal industry. Now, during the 18th century, some of its great visitors included David Garrick, Dr. Joshua Reynolds and Dr. Samuel Johnson, but we're not really interested in its visitors, but rather its inhabitant, Silky. Now, according to Vanessa Histon in her book Nightmare on Grey Street, there was a rumour that Silky was a girl who'd been strangled by her jealous sister, and apparently she could be recognised because she wore a white silk dress as she moved around the hall. Now, in some of the stories, Silky was actually quite a kind and gentle spirit, and she would care for anyone who was ill and she'd kind of keep watch over them until they recovered. But then other stories painted her as actually being quite terrifying, with visitors leaving as soon as they possibly could, although Histon doesn't go into any detail as to how she was so terrifying. Now, it is noted that this Silky didn't apparently speak, but she did make noises around the building. And in 1884, people reported hearing something being dragged through 2 empty rooms and then down a flight of stairs. Now, villagers in the surrounding area also claim to have some kind of interaction with Silky, which does show that her area of influence, as it were, stretched beyond the hall, and they actually claim to hear her, and the local pitmen believe that she warned about dangers in the nearby mine. Now, Histon also reports another tale from the 19th century, and in this one, a young lady was staying at East Denton Hall and one evening attended a ball at Newcastle's old assembly rooms. She met a young man that she liked, but when she returned to the hall and she was starting to get ready for bed, she found an old woman in a satin gown sitting in her room. The old woman offered a warning that the young lady wouldn't be so happy if she knew what was in her future, and then apparently proceeded to ramble on about the youth of today. The young woman realised that she couldn't actually see the old lady reflected in her mirror, and at the point that she realised this, the old woman vanished. And the younger woman heard the rustling of silk and footsteps heading for the door. However, on closer inspection, she found that the door was still locked, just as she'd left it when she got back from the ball. Now, unsurprisingly, the young woman moved to another room and didn't sleep in the room again, and it looks like she married the young man, but obviously no one knows if the old woman's warning came true because I can't actually find when this even happened. But obviously that's not the end of it, because K.M. Briggs actually noted in a 1961 article for Folklore that tales of the Denton Hall Silky actually continued into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and she noted that a woman named Mrs. Warner, who was a member of a Quaker family in Northumberland, continued the story for her. And as Mrs. Warner's story went, Mrs. Warner's mother used to visit two old ladies who lived at Denton Hall when Mrs. Warner was a girl. Naturally, she took the young Mrs. Warner with her, and these visits occurred between 1887 and 1902. And these two old ladies actually talked about Silky, but they wouldn't let visitors laugh at her, so they actually seemed quite protective over Silky. And while Silky's antics did make it hard to keep their staff, Silky would also do things around the house for them, and a particular thing that stood out for Mrs. Warner was the fact that Silky would lay the fires so that they were ready to be lit when the two old ladies came down. And she would also leave bunches of flowers on the staircase for the old ladies, which I just think sounds like a really nice thing to do. Now, this Silky apparently wore grey silk, so not the white silk of the original Silky at the very beginning, or indeed flowered satin of the earlier story about the woman being seen in the mirror. But the visits stopped in 1902 because the Warner family left Newcastle. And then when Mrs. Warner returned to Newcastle during the Second World War, she then found that an old friend now owned Denton Hall. And according to him, he'd seen and heard nothing around the hall, but his son's bedroom appeared to be at the centre of a poltergeist haunting. The man wouldn't talk about it, finding himself angered by the events, and the family soon left Denton Hall. And I think this sudden discussion of a poltergeist haunting does show how language changes and how understanding of different topics can change how people understand what's actually going on. Now, East Denton Hall became the official residence of the Roman Catholic Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle in 1942, and apparently that seemed to end any sightings of Silky whatsoever. Now, the diocese sold the property in 2020, although I can't quite find out who bought it and what they're using it for, so I would love to know if they've actually had any disturbances since moving in, if indeed anyone has moved in yet. So the big question is Silky a ghost or a fairy? Now, I'm including her under different types of fairy, but obviously there are some people who put her down as being a type of ghost. Now, Briggs notes the similarity between the fairies and ghosts in the Denton Hall tale, and she suggests that this might be because at the time ghost stories were more common than fairy stories, and indeed, and I quote, "One might be tempted to say that this age is the last in which any traditional fairy anecdotes will be found," end quote, and remember that was 1961. Now, ghost stories are incredibly malleable and they suit the era in which they're found, and that's why the appearances and motivations of ghosts change over the years to keep up with the belief in ghosts. And I did do a review ages and ages ago now on Susan Owen's book about the cultural history of ghosts, and if you're interested in how ghost stories have changed, that's a really good place to start. And obviously there's also A Natural History of Ghosts by Roger Clark as well. But fairy stories have really appeared to fall out of fashion in a lot of ways, but I would actually argue that they're actually just reappearing in a different guise. So if you look, for example, at the tale of Thomas the Rhymer, who we've also looked at before, he's seemingly taken to fairyland for 7 years and then returns with this magical power of prophecy. And in a way, it actually sounds quite familiar, or at least it does if you look at alien abduction stories. So it is possible that a story previously considered to be about fairies, as the Silky stories were in Richardson's era, could then be reworked to sound more like a ghost story by the time you start getting towards the end of the 19th and then well into the 20th century. And indeed, this could explain the third Silky that appears in the records in the northeast. And according to Henderson, some people thought that she was a ghost. So this particular Silky appears at Churton near North Shields. And during William III's reign, the Duke of Argyll had a mistress, and he himself lived at Churton. And his mistress suddenly died there, not without suspicion of murder, as Henderson puts it. So this idea of a vengeful spirit fits in really well with late 19th century ideas about ghosts, rather than the concept of a Silky. However, Richardson actually mentions that particular Silky in the 1840s, and he describes her as being a sprite and discusses how she made it impossible for Churton's owners to find tenants. Now, it's not clear how, although he does mention unearthly noises, so it does make you think, was the Silky already there and someone's then just bolted on this idea of the vengeful spirit following the suspected murder, because that would make more sense to people in a later time? Or was this Silky actually a ghost, or was she a fairy? Now, obviously, there is crossover between hauntings and noisy fairies, but it is quite interesting, I think, that Richardson and Henderson present the same figure in two different ways. And in some ways, the unearthly noises at Churton sound a lot like the unexplained noises at East Denton Hall. Look at the change from the helpful Silky of Mrs. Warner's childhood that the two old ladies spoke so warmly of, to the poltergeist activity following the war. Is it the same Silky but different classification? We don't know. So what do we ultimately make of the Northumberland Silky? Well, to Henderson, the Silky stands out because the stories, and I quote, date from a period when silk was not in common use and therefore attracted notice in country places, end quote. And again, this makes a lot of sense that obviously if people weren't wearing silk, obviously particularly out in like Blackheddon in Northumberland in the 1770s, people would notice somebody who was. But then it is quite difficult to know if the old woman in Histon's story was Silky in a different guise because she's described so differently from the earlier young murder victim in white silk figure, particularly since the old woman's actually in satin, but then the young lady here is silk. So it's almost like lots of different factors are at play in that story. Now, the old woman could be Silky, using her fairy powers of prophecy to warn the young lady. She could indeed be a spirit, and if you really want to stretch it, she might even have been the spirit of the young woman in the far future trying to warn her younger self. Who knows? Now, the Silky stories related by Briggs, I feel, are much more in keeping with the earlier ideas of Silky. So she sounds playful when she's around people she likes, like the two old women, and she's angry around those that she doesn't, who perhaps disrespect her in some way. And obviously, as we've covered before on this podcast, never, never disrespect the fair folk. But the idea of Silky helping around the house at the Hall also fits in with the earlier ideas of Silky tidying messy houses. So perhaps Silky really is a sprite and we simply misinterpret her as a ghost in an era more disposed towards the supernatural than to fairies. So maybe she's still out there, or maybe she's returned to the other world. Wherever she is, I hope that she's content. But what I want to know is, what do you think? Do you think that Silky is a fairy? Do you think that she's a ghost? Do you think that there's a whole load of crossover between the two? I mean, I'm genuinely interested. So if you are watching this on YouTube, obviously feel free to just drop a comment below. That's obviously the easiest way of doing it. You can always tweet me. You can contact me on Instagram, whatever's easier for you. Also, you can always drop comments on Facebook as well. All the links are in the show notes below. But I'm very, very fond of the Northumberland Silky, and she's one of the stories that's always stood out for me since I was about 10 and first heard her story, particularly the idea of the treasure coming through the ceiling. That bit always stuck with me. So there we go. We are also going to be having a look at the bar guest next week, which is an interesting figure, shall we say. So I'll be fascinated to see what you make of that, and also what you think of this kind of tour of Northumberland and North East folklore around all these different areas as well. So I hope that you're enjoying that. Anyway, this is obviously a little bit more like actual folklore as well, other than the me wandering off into mythology as well. So hopefully that's a little bit more your style. So I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I'll see you next week, as I say, when we go off to meet the bar guest. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.